He was just the quiet man who checked IDs at the base entrance, invisible to the soldiers who barely acknowledged his presence. But when the emergency drill began and chaos erupted, Danny's father moved with a precision that made a decorated major whisper in shock. "That's not security training. That's special operations." Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden service, sacrifice, and the guardians who protect us in silence, tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this video today? And if you believe that true protectors often work unseen, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Carson as Roberto Martinez arrived for his 6 a.m. shift at the main gate, the same time he'd been arriving for the past 6 years. At 51, he moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone who understood that security was about attention to detail, not dramatic gestures. His gray uniform was always pressed, his black boots polished to military standards despite working as a civilian contractor. To most of the soldiers passing through the checkpoint, Roberto was just another piece of the base infrastructure, as unremarkable as the concrete barriers or the security cameras. They flashed their IDs without making eye contact, grunted responses to his polite greetings, treated him like part of the machinery that kept the base functioning. But Roberto saw everything. He noticed which soldiers were struggling with personal problems, which vehicles had been modified since their last inspection, which visitors seemed nervous or out of place. He had developed an instinct for reading people and situations that went far beyond his security duties, though he kept his observations to himself unless absolutely necessary. What they didn't know, what nobody at Fort Carson knew, was that Roberto had once patrolled a very different kind of border, that his calm, methodical approach to security came from years of tracking smugglers and cartels through terrain where one mistake meant death, that he had protected America's borders with skills that would make most special operations units take notice. 3 miles away, in the barracks of the 4th Infantry Division, Private First Class Danny Martinez was getting dressed for morning PT, trying to ignore the familiar conversation happening around him. His fellow soldiers were discussing their families again, a ritual that never failed to make his stomach clench with familiar dread. "My dad's deploying with the Rangers next month," announced Private Jackson, a cocky kid from Texas whose every sentence sounded like a recruitment poster. "3rd deployment, all classified stuff." "That's hardcore," replied Private Williams, adjusting his PT uniform. "My old man's a drill sergeant at Benning, been breaking recruits for 15 years. Danny pulled on his running shoes, hoping to escape before the conversation turned his way. These discussions always followed the same pattern, each soldier trying to establish their military heritage, their connection to the warrior culture that defined their identity. But his luck ran out, as it always did. "What about you, Martinez?" The question came from Sergeant Thompson, a squad leader who seemed to take particular pleasure in putting younger soldiers on the spot. "You never talk about your family. What's your dad do?" Danny felt the familiar heat rising in his cheeks. The barracks seemed to grow quiet around him as a dozen pairs of eyes turned in his direction. "He works on base," Danny said quietly, hoping that would satisfy them. "On base?" Thompson's eyebrows shot up with interest. "What unit? Infantry? Artillery?" "He's civilian," Danny admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken judgment. Then Jackson let out a short laugh. "Civilian? Like what, cafeteria worker?" Danny felt his throat constrict. "Security. Security," Thompson repeated, his tone shifting from curiosity to mockery. "You mean like a rent-a-cop? One of those guys who checks IDs at the gate?" The laughter that erupted from the group hit Danny like a physical blow. He had endured this humiliation before, but it never got easier. "That's hilarious," Jackson said, wiping tears from his eyes. "Your dad's basically a mall cop. No wonder you're so soft, Martinez. You don't have any warrior blood in you." Danny stared at his boots, willing himself not to react. He thought about his father, somewhere on the base at that very moment, quietly doing work that these soldiers considered beneath notice. The same man who had worked double shifts to help pay for Danny's education, who had never once complained about the long hours or the disrespect. "Maybe that's why you're always so careful in training," Thompson added, his voice carrying that particular edge that meant he was just getting started. "Daddy never taught you how to be aggressive. Hard to learn combat skills from someone whose biggest challenge is asking for ID cards." The group erupted in fresh laughter, and Danny felt something break inside him. Not anger. He was used to that. Something deeper, more painful. The realization that he was ashamed of the man who had sacrificed everything for his success. Before anyone could say more, the barracks door burst open and Drill Sergeant Hayes entered with his usual morning thunder. "Listen up, ladies. Change of plans. We've got a surprise security drill in 30 minutes. Full gear, live ammunition, and I want to see some actual military bearing for once in your pathetic lives." The mockery stopped immediately as the soldiers scrambled to prepare for the exercise, but Danny could still feel the weight of their judgment, the assumption that his family background made him somehow less worthy of wearing the uniform. An hour later, Danny found himself crouched behind a concrete barrier as part of a simulated base defense exercise. The scenario was complex. Terrorist infiltration, multiple breach points, and a command structure that was being tested under pressure. Through his position near the main gate, Danny could see his father at the security checkpoint, calmly directing civilian traffic away from the exercise area. Roberto moved with the same steady professionalism Danny had observed his entire life, treating the drill with the seriousness it deserved despite not being an official participant. That's when everything went wrong. The exercise called for a simulated breach of the main perimeter, but a communication error had left several squads out of position. What should have been a controlled drill suddenly became chaos as enemy forces penetrated deeper into the base than planned. Danny watched from his position as his squad leader, Sergeant Thompson, tried to coordinate a response over the radio. But Thompson was clearly overwhelmed, his voice becoming higher and more frantic as the situation deteriorated. "Unit 7, where are you? I need eyes on the north perimeter." Thompson barked into his radio, sweat already beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The response was garbled, lost in the confusion of multiple units trying to communicate simultaneously. Danny could see that the exercise was spinning out of control, becoming dangerous rather than educational. That's when he noticed his father. Roberto had abandoned his position at the security checkpoint and was moving across the compound with a purposefulness that Danny had never seen before. His father wasn't running or shouting like the soldiers around him. Instead, he moved with calculated precision, his eyes scanning the terrain in a pattern that seemed almost mathematical. Danny watched, transfixed, as Roberto positioned himself at a slight elevation that provided visual command of the entire exercise area. From there, he began speaking quietly into what appeared to be a radio, his voice calm and authoritative. "Command, this is checkpoint actual. You have hostile movement in sectors 7 and 9, approximately 40 meters north of the communications array. Recommend immediate flanking maneuver using cover from building complex Alpha." Danny blinked in surprise. That wasn't the voice of a security guard, that was the voice of someone with tactical command experience. Major Davidson, the exercise commander, responded immediately over the radio. "Checkpoint actual. Identify yourself." "Security contractor Martinez, sir. I have elevated position with clear sightlines to the entire operational area." There was a pause, then Major Davidson's voice again, now carrying a tone of interest rather than irritation. "Martinez, what do you see?" Roberto's response was crisp, professional, and devastatingly accurate. "Sir, hostile forces have established a defensive position using the motor pool as cover. They're attempting to flank your main force through the vehicle maintenance area. I recommend a two-pronged approach, direct engagement from the east, while a secondary team approaches from the communications building." Danny stared at his father in amazement. This wasn't the quiet, unassuming man who checked IDs and made small talk with visitors. This was someone who understood tactical warfare at a level that made experienced officers take notice. Major Davidson's voice crackled over the radio again. "All units, implement the flanking maneuver suggested by checkpoint actual. Team Alpha, move to eastern position. Team Bravo, approach through communications building." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Within minutes, the hostile forces found themselves outmaneuvered and overwhelmed by a coordinated response that had been orchestrated by the man Danny's fellow soldiers had mocked as a rent-a-cop. But Roberto wasn't finished. As the exercise continued, Danny watched his father provide a running commentary of tactical observations that demonstrated an understanding of battlefield dynamics that exceeded most of the officers on base. "Command, be advised that hostile forces are attempting to regroup near the fuel depot. Recommend cutting off their retreat route through Sector 12. Command, you have a blind spot developing on your southern flank. Suggest repositioning Team Charlie to maintain perimeter integrity." Each suggestion was immediately implemented, and each proved devastatingly effective. The exercise, which had been spiraling toward failure, became a textbook example of coordinated tactical response. Danny found himself staring at his father with new eyes. The methodical movements he'd always admired suddenly made sense. They weren't just the habits of a careful security guard, but the ingrained behaviors of someone trained in tactical surveillance and perimeter defense. As the exercise concluded, Danny saw Major Davidson approaching Roberto's position, Even from a distance, he could see that the Major's posture was different, respectful, even deferential. "Martinez," Major Davidson said as he reached Roberto's position, "that was exceptional work. Where did you learn tactical coordination like that?" Roberto straightened slightly, and Danny noticed that his father's bearing had changed. The quiet, unassuming security guard had been replaced by someone who carried himself with unmistakable military authority. "Border Patrol, sir. Special Operations Division. 15 years along the southern border." Major Davidson's expression shifted from respect to genuine awe. "BORTAC?" "Yes, sir." Danny felt his understanding of his father shift completely. "BORTAC, Border Patrol, Tactical Unit. Elite federal agents trained to operate in the most dangerous environments along America's borders. The kind of operators who hunted cartels and human traffickers in terrain where backup might be hours away." "How long?" Major Davidson asked. "Full career, sir. Retired 3 years ago. And you're working security at our front gate." Roberto looked toward the checkpoint where Danny could see a line of vehicles beginning to form as normal base operations resumed. "Someone needs to make sure this place stays safe, sir, and it pays well enough to help my son through his enlistment." Major Davidson followed Roberto's gaze, then looked back with something approaching reverence. "Your son is lucky to have you. I'm lucky to have him," Roberto replied simply. As Major Davidson walked away, clearly processing what he'd just learned, Danny found himself staring at his father from across the compound. The man he'd been embarrassed by, ashamed of, had just demonstrated tactical expertise that impressed a decorated Army major. That evening, Danny found Roberto finishing his shift at the security checkpoint, logging the day's activities with the same meticulous attention to detail he applied to everything. "Dad," Danny said quietly as Roberto locked up the checkpoint station. Roberto looked up and smiled with the same warmth he'd always shown. "How was the exercise today?" "You tell me," Danny said. "You seem to know what was going on better than anyone else." Roberto's expression became thoughtful. "Sometimes experience from one job helps with another. BORTAC isn't just one job, Dad. That's elite federal law enforcement." Roberto finished gathering his paperwork before responding. "That was then. This is now." They walked toward the parking area in comfortable silence, but Danny's mind was racing with questions. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Danny finally asked. "Tell you what? About what you did? About who you were?" Roberto stopped walking and turned to face his son. "Because I wanted you to see me as your father, not as an operator. That part of my life was about hunting dangerous people. This part is about raising a good man. But you gave up everything, your career, your status, everything." "I didn't give up anything that mattered," Roberto said firmly. "I traded one mission for another. The first one was about protecting borders. This one is about protecting you." Danny struggled to process this. "But people don't respect you. They think you're just a security guard." "Let them," Roberto said with a shrug. "Respect isn't something you wear on your sleeve. It's something you earn through your actions. But you could have told me. I've been ashamed of you, and you could have stopped that with one conversation." Pain flickered across Roberto's face. "You think I didn't know that? You think it didn't hurt when you avoided talking about me, when you acted like my work was something to be embarrassed about?" Danny felt tears starting to form. "Then why didn't you say something?" "Because shame is something you have to overcome yourself. If I'd told you about BORTAC, you would have been proud of who I used to be, not who I chose to become." They reached Roberto's truck, a practical vehicle that had seen better days but was maintained with military precision. "Who you chose to become," Danny repeated. "A father, a protector, someone who keeps this base safe not because it's exciting or prestigious, but because it matters. Because every soldier who passes through that gate deserves to know someone is watching their back." Danny looked at his father, really looked at him, and saw someone he'd never fully understood before, not a man who had settled for less, but someone who had chosen what mattered most. "The guys in my unit," Danny said quietly, "they were making fun of you today, calling you a mall cop." "I know," Roberto said, "I heard them." "Doesn't that bother you? Should it?" Roberto asked. "Their opinion doesn't change what I've done or who I am." Danny thought about the exercise, about watching his father coordinate a tactical response that impressed seasoned officers. "Major Davidson was amazed by what you did today. Major Davidson is a good officer. He recognizes competence when he sees it. Are you going to tell him you want a different position? Something that uses your skills?" Roberto shook his head. "I'm exactly where I need to be. Checking IDs when you could be training special operations? Keeping my son safe while he learns to be a soldier," Roberto corrected. "Making sure he comes home every night while he figures out who he wants to be." Over the following days, word of the exercise spread through Fort Carson with the speed of military gossip. The story grew in the telling. The security guard, who was secretly a BORTAC operator, who had saved a failing exercise with tactical expertise that impressed field commanders. Danny found himself the subject of a different kind of attention from his fellow soldiers. Instead of the mocking pity he'd grown accustomed to, his squad mates looked at him with something approaching awe. "Your dad's a legend," Private Jackson told him during chow. "Sergeant Thompson can't stop talking about how he coordinated that flanking maneuver. Major Davidson said he's never seen better tactical awareness from a civilian," added Private Williams. "He wants to recruit your father for the training cadre." But Danny wasn't interested in his fellow soldiers' sudden respect. He was more concerned with understanding the man who had raised him, the federal agent who had become a security guard, the tactical expert who had chosen invisibility. He found Roberto during his lunch break, eating a sandwich while monitoring the security cameras with the same careful attention he applied to everything. "Dad," Danny said, sitting beside him in the small security office, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you miss it? The action, the importance, being someone that people automatically respected?" Roberto was quiet for a moment, considering the question carefully. "Sometimes," he admitted, "there was a clarity to that work. You always knew exactly what was at stake, exactly who the enemy was. But you chose this. You chose to be ordinary." "I chose to be present," Roberto corrected. "I chose to be able to come home to the same person every day, to watch my son grow up, to be part of his life instead of just a story he told about his absent father." Danny thought about all the military families he knew, the deployments and separations, the children who barely knew their parents. "But you could have stayed in BORTAC and still been present." Roberto shook his head. "BORTAC doesn't work that way. When you're hunting cartels along the border, you can be gone for weeks at a time. No communication, no contact, no guarantee you're coming home. So you gave it up for me. I chose it for you," Roberto said. "And for me, I wanted to be your father, not just someone who visited between missions." That afternoon, Danny was called to Major Davidson's office. He expected another routine briefing, but instead found himself facing a conversation that would change his understanding of his father even more. "Private Martinez," Major Davidson said, "I wanted to talk to you about your father." "Yes, sir. I've been doing some research into his background. BORTAC operators are among the most elite federal agents in the country. Your father's record is impressive." Danny nodded, not sure what response was expected. 15 years along the most dangerous sections of the southern border, multiple commendations for operations I can't even discuss. He saved more lives and stopped more criminal operations than most entire units accomplish. Major Davidson leaned forward. "The question is, why is someone with that background working as a security guard? To be close to me, sir, to make sure I had a stable home." "That's what he told me," Major Davidson confirmed. "But I wanted to hear it from you, because what your father did, giving up a legendary career to support his son's military service, that's the kind of sacrifice that defines character." Danny felt a complex mixture of pride and guilt. "I didn't know, sir, about his background." "Because he didn't want you to know. He wanted you to respect him for who he chose to be, not who he used to be." Major Davidson stood up and moved to the window, looking out toward the main gate where Roberto was working. "Your father could have any job he wanted. Federal agencies would fight to recruit him. Private security companies would pay him more in a year than he makes here in 5. But he stays." "He stays," Major Davidson confirmed, "because being your father is more important to him than being a legend." That evening, Danny found Roberto finishing his shift with the same quiet efficiency he'd observed his entire life. But now he saw it differently, not as the habits of a simple security guard, but as the discipline of someone who had never stopped being a warrior, even if his battlefield had changed. "Dad," Danny said as they walked to the parking area together. "Yes, I'm sorry. For what? For being ashamed of you. For wishing you were something else." Roberto stopped walking and looked at his son. "You weren't ashamed of me. You were ashamed of what you thought I represented." "What's the difference?" "The difference is that you know who I really am now, and you're still here, still walking with me, still proud to be my son." Danny felt tears starting to form. "I've always been proud to be your son. I just didn't understand what that meant. And now?" Danny looked at his father, the BORTAC operator who had become a security guard, the tactical expert who had chosen love over legacy, the warrior who had found a different way to serve. "Now I understand that being your son means more than any uniform or rank or recognition could ever mean." Roberto smiled, the kind of smile that held 15 years of dangerous missions and 28 years of unconditional love. "That's all I ever wanted you to know." As they drove home together, Danny thought about heroes and sacrifices, about the difference between being feared and being loved. He thought about his father, who had traded a legendary career in federal law enforcement for the quiet dignity of being present for every important moment of his son's life, and he realized that true strength wasn't about commanding respect from strangers. It was about earning love from the people who mattered most, and being willing to be underestimated by the world if it meant being everything to someone who needed you. Roberto Martinez had been a BORTAC operator, an elite federal agent whose operations had protected America's borders from the most dangerous criminals in the world. But his greatest mission had been performed not in the deserts of the borderlands, but in the quiet moments of everyday life, teaching his son that honor wasn't about recognition, but about choosing love over legacy. Some heroes hunt cartels and stop smugglers. Others check IDs and monitor security cameras, protecting in ways that no one sees, serving in silence because that's what love requires. Both kinds of heroes matter, but only one kind gets to drive you home after difficult days and remind you that your worth isn't measured by other people's opinions. Roberto Martinez had chosen to be that kind of hero, and in the end, that choice had made all the difference, not just for his son, but for everyone whose life Danny would touch as a soldier who had learned that true service begins with understanding the value of quiet sacrifice. The security guard's secret wasn't just that he had been a federal agent, it was that he had chosen presence over prestige, love over legend, and his son's future over his own recognition. That's the kind of secret worth keeping, and the kind of hero worth celebrating, even if the celebration happens quietly, in the grateful heart of the child who was protected every single day.